What happens when you open a letter you've kept sealed for 20 years, live on television, and the truth inside changes everything? Stop the tape. Stop everything right now. Dr. Phil's voice cut through the studio like a knife. The woman in the chair was trembling, holding a yellowed envelope that looked like it had been through 2 decades of hiding. And inside that envelope was a truth nobody in the room, or watching at home, was prepared for. What happened in the next 12 minutes would become one of the most powerful moments in daytime television history. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, a 47-year-old mother of 2 from Ohio. She had written to the Dr. Phil show 3 times before finally being invited. Her letter to producers was simple. I've been carrying something for 20 years that's destroying me. I need help opening it. When Dr. Phil first read her case file backstage, he knew this wasn't going to be a typical episode. His production team had briefed him, woman, mid-40s, stable life, good family, no apparent crisis. But she was carrying a sealed letter from her late mother that she never had the courage to open. Why now? Dr. Phil had asked his senior producer. She says she's ready? But I'm not sure she is, Phil. Dr. Phil walked onto that stage with one goal: help this woman face whatever was in that envelope. He had no idea he was about to witness something that would test every bit of his 40 years of experience. The studio audience settled into their seats. The cameras rolled. Sarah sat in the signature burgundy chair, the envelope clutched in both hands like a life raft. Dr. Phil opened simply, the way he always did with the fragile cases. Sarah, thank you for being here. Tell me about that envelope. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. My mother gave this to me 3 days before she died. She made me promise not to open it until I was ready. That was 20 years ago. The audience was silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. And you've never opened it? Dr. Phil leaned forward, his voice gentle but direct. Never. I've tried. Hundreds of times. I've held it up to the light. I've almost torn it open in moments of weakness. But something always stopped me. Dr. Phil studied her face. This wasn't about curiosity. This was about fear. Sarah, what are you afraid is inside that letter? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's hands began to shake visibly. I'm afraid. She paused, tears forming. I'm afraid my mother knew. Knew what? Knew about the choice I made. The choice that destroyed our relationship in her final year. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dr. Phil recognized that look. It was the look of someone carrying a secret so heavy it had bent their entire life around it. Tell me about that choice, he said softly. Sarah took a deep breath. The story came out in pieces, like fragments of glass. 21 years ago, Sarah had been engaged to a man named Michael. Her mother loved him. The wedding was planned. Everything was perfect. Then Sarah met someone else. Someone her mother had explicitly warned her against. Someone from a troubled background, as her mother had called him. Sarah fell in love anyway. I broke off the engagement 2 months before the wedding. My mother was devastated. She said I was making the biggest mistake of my life. We barely spoke for the next year. And then she got sick. Dr. Phil stated, not asked. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. She had 3 months. The studio was so quiet you could hear the overhead lights humming. In those final weeks, we reconciled. Sort of. We talked, spent time together. But there was always this tension. This unspoken thing between us. 3 days before she died, she handed me this envelope and said, you'll know when you're ready. Dr. Phil looked at the envelope. It was worn, the edges soft from years of being held. There was something written on the front in shaky handwriting. For Sarah. When you're ready to forgive. Forgive who, Sarah? You or her? Sarah's face crumpled. I don't know. That's what I'm afraid to find out. Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. He stood up, which he rarely did during tapings. He walked over to Sarah's chair and knelt down beside her, something his back usually protested, but he ignored it. Sarah, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Not with the cameras, not with the audience. With yourself. She nodded, tears streaming freely now. Do you want to open that letter? The question seemed simple, but it carried weight. Sarah looked at the envelope, then at Dr. Phil, then out at the audience. Some people were crying. Others were leaning so far forward in their seats they looked like they might fall. I'm terrified, she whispered. I know. But that wasn't my question. Do you want to open it? A long pause. Then barely audible. Yes. Dr. Phil stood up and did something no one expected. He turned to the cameras and said, Stop the tape. The red lights on the cameras stayed on. They never actually stopped rolling during tapings, but the gesture was clear. This moment was bigger than the show. Sarah, you don't have to do this here. We can go off stage. We can do this in private. You don't owe us, or them, or anyone this moment. Sarah looked at the envelope again. Then she looked at Dr. Phil with eyes that had made a decision. No. I need to do this here. I need witnesses. I've hidden from this for 20 years. I'm done hiding. Dr. Phil nodded slowly. He returned to his chair but pulled it closer to hers, close enough that their knees were almost touching. The studio audience seemed to collectively hold their breath. Whenever you're ready, Dr. Phil said simply. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the envelope over. The seal had been there so long it had yellowed and become brittle. She looked at Dr. Phil one more time. He gave her the smallest nod, a gesture that said, I'm right here. She slid her finger under the flap. The seal broke with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent studio. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice. Sarah unfolded it with trembling hands. And then she read. What happened next is something no one in the room, or watching at home, saw coming. Sarah's face went through a transformation. First shock, her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly. Then confusion, her eyebrows drew together. Then something broke. She began to sob, but not the way she had been crying before. These were different tears. Dr. Phil reached over and placed his hand on her shoulder. Sarah? Do you want to share what it says? She couldn't speak. She just handed him the letter. Dr. Phil read it silently first. His expression changed too. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a breath, then looked at Sarah. May I read this out loud? Sarah nodded, unable to form words. Dr. Phil's voice, usually so strong and steady, carried a slight tremor as he read. My dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then you were finally ready to forgive yourself. I want you to know something that I should have told you when I was alive, but I was too proud, too stubborn. You made the right choice. Michael was the safe choice, but he wasn't your choice. And I knew that. I knew it the moment you told me about breaking the engagement. I saw your face when you talked about the man you actually loved, and I saw something I had never seen before. You were yourself. Completely, fully yourself. I was angry because I was scared. Scared that you would get hurt. Scared that I would lose my daughter to someone I didn't understand. But watching you in those final weeks, seeing you with him, I realized something. You had already found what I spent a lifetime searching for. True love. Not perfect love. Not safe love. True love. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to choose between me and your happiness. You never should have had to make that choice. I'm sorry I wasted that year being angry instead of being grateful that my daughter had found what so few people ever find. Forgive yourself, Sarah. You have nothing to apologize for. You followed your heart, and that's exactly what I raised you to do, even when it scared me. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I want you to know that I saw the way he looked at you at my bedside. Any man who looks at my daughter with that much love has my blessing. I just wish I'd told you that while I could still say it out loud. Live your life, sweetheart. Love him fully. Raise your babies. I know they're coming. I saw that look in your eye. And when you think of me, don't remember the year we wasted fighting. Remember the lifetime we had loving each other. You were ready to forgive yourself the moment you opened this letter. Mom. The studio erupted. Not in applause, that would have been wrong for the moment. In collective emotion. People were openly sobbing. Dr. Phil's producers were crying behind the cameras. Even the normally stoic cameramen had tears in their eyes. Sarah was completely broken open, crying in a way that sounded like 20 years of grief finally being released. Dr. Phil set the letter down gently on the table between them and moved his chair even closer. He didn't speak. He just sat there, present, letting her have her moment. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. He gestured to someone in the wings. Moments later, a man emerged from backstage, tall, early 50s, with kind eyes that were also filled with tears. He walked onto the stage and knelt beside Sarah's chair. Sarah, Dr. Phil said gently, I took the liberty of calling David. Your husband. The man your mother was writing about. I thought you might want him here for this. Sarah looked up at her husband and completely fell apart in his arms. The audience watched as 20 years of guilt, fear, and unresolved grief poured out of her. Dr. Phil let them have that moment. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to move the show along. He just sat back and let love do its work. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After several minutes, when Sarah had regained enough composure to speak, Dr. Phil asked the question that mattered most. Sarah, what are you feeling right now? She laughed through her tears, a sound of pure relief. Free. For the first time in 20 years I feel free. Your mother knew you, Dr. Phil said. She knew exactly what you needed to hear. And she knew exactly when you'd be ready to hear it. Sarah looked at the letter, then at her husband, then at Dr. Phil. All these years, I thought she died angry at me. I thought she died disappointed. She died loving you. And she died hoping you would forgive yourself for choosing happiness. But what happened after the show revealed the true power of that moment. The episode aired 6 weeks later. Within hours it had gone viral. Not because of drama or conflict or spectacle, but because it had touched something universal, the fear of disappointing the people we love most. The show's website crashed from the traffic. Thousands of people wrote in, sharing their own stories of letters never sent, words never spoken, forgiveness never asked for. Dr. Phil received a personal email from Sarah 2 weeks after the episode aired. She had framed her mother's letter and hung it in her living room. She and David had renewed their vows in a small ceremony with their 2 teenage children present. But the most important part of her message was this. Dr. Phil, you gave me permission to forgive myself. But more than that, you gave millions of other people permission too. I've received over 10,000 messages from people who watched the show and finally made the call, wrote the letter, opened the door they'd been afraid to open. You didn't just help me that day. You helped all of us. Dr. Phil kept a copy of that email in his office. Years later, when asked about the most impactful episodes of his career, he always mentioned Sarah's letter. Not because it was the most dramatic or the most shocking, but because it reminded him why he did this work. People come to the show with their pain, he would explain. My job isn't to fix them. My job is to help them see that they already have everything they need to heal. Sarah carried that letter for 20 years because she wasn't ready. The moment she was ready, she opened it. And inside, she found exactly what she needed, permission to be happy. The letter itself became a symbol. Producers began receiving requests from audience members asking if they could bring their own, unopened letters, metaphorical or literal, to the show. Dr. Phil created a segment called The Letter You Need to Hear, where he worked with people carrying guilt, shame, or unresolved pain. But Sarah's episode remained the gold standard. It had everything: genuine emotion, a universal theme, and a resolution that honored both the pain and the healing. The yellow envelope stayed with Sarah for the rest of her life. She would later tell interviewers that she read her mother's letter every year on the anniversary of her death. And each time, she found something new in the words, some layer of wisdom she hadn't been ready to receive before. The letter didn't change, she would say. I did. That's what my mother knew. She knew I would grow into the person who could receive her forgiveness. She just had to wait for me to be ready. And perhaps that's the most profound lesson from that day in the studio. Sometimes the answers we're desperately seeking are already in our hands. We just need the courage to open the envelope. Dr. Phil didn't give Sarah that courage. He didn't provide the answers. All he did was create a space safe enough for her to face what she'd been carrying. And in that space, she found what she'd been searching for all along, not her mother's forgiveness, but permission to forgive herself. The cameras captured it all, the tears, the revelation, the healing. But what they couldn't capture was the shift that happened in that room. The way every person present felt a little lighter, a little more hopeful, a little more willing to face their own unopened letters. That's the power of truth. That's the power of vulnerability. And that's the power of a television show that, for one extraordinary episode, became something more than entertainment. It became a mirror where millions of people saw their own pain reflected and, maybe for the first time, believed that healing was possible. Sarah Mitchell opened a letter that day. But in doing so, she opened something far more important, the door to her own forgiveness. And Dr. Phil stood witness to it all, not as a host, not as a celebrity, but as a human being honoring another human being's journey back to wholeness.